summer 1944, somewhere in rural Virginia. The bus pulled off the main road and onto a gravel track that wound through fields of tobacco and dry summer grass. And the men sitting inside it looked out the windows at a landscape so unlike anything they had ever seen that several of them, for the first time in months, forgot to be afraid. There were 43 of them on that bus. German soldiers. Africa Corps veterans, most of them, captured in Tunisia the previous year when the entire German and Italian position in North Africa had collapsed and 250,000 Axis troops had gone into captivity in the space of a few days. They had expected to be shot. That was what the propaganda had told them would happen. Americans did not take prisoners, or if they did, they worked them to death in mines or used them for medical experiments. The propaganda had been specific about this, because specific details are more frightening than vague ones, and frightened men fight harder than men who believe surrender is a viable option. Nobody had shot them. They had been processed, fed, given medical treatment for wounds that the conditions of the North African campaign had left untreated for weeks, loaded onto ships, and transported across the Atlantic to a country whose scale they were only now beginning to comprehend. The United States of America. A nation so large and so far from any front that it had been almost impossible to visualize from inside the Third Reich, which had organized its geography and its imagery around the compressed distances of Europe. At the end of the gravel track was a prisoner of war camp. Wire fences, wooden barracks, guard towers with searchlights that swept the perimeter at night. Nothing unusual about any of that. What was unusual was everything else. The grass inside the wire was cut. The barracks were painted. There was a recreation yard with a basketball court and a vegetable garden that some previous group of prisoners had planted, and that had apparently been tended and harvested and replanted. There was a canteen visible through one of the barrack windows, and through that window several of the men on the bus could see shelves stocked with goods that had not existed in significant quantities in Germany for 2 years. One of the men on the bus was a corporal named Heinrich Brandt. He was 24 years old, from a small town outside Hamburg, the son of a toolmaker who had voted for the National Socialists in 1933 and regretted it by 1935, but had not said so out loud because the consequences of saying so out loud were well understood by that point. Heinrich had been conscripted at 18, trained as an infantryman, sent to North Africa at 22, and captured at 23 in conditions so chaotic that he had surrendered to an American sergeant who was eating a sandwich at the time and who had accepted the surrender without interrupting his lunch. Heinrich Brandt looked out the bus window at the camp and said something that the man sitting next to him would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "This is not what they told us." He was right. It was not what they had told them. And what happened over the next 18 months in that camp and in the dozens of camps like it scattered across the American interior was not what anyone on either side had fully anticipated, and it would produce a confrontation that was, in its way, as revealing about the nature of the war and the nature of the men fighting it as anything that happened on any battlefield. To understand what occurred in the American prisoner of war camps during the Second World War, you have to understand the context in which they existed, because nothing about the American handling of German prisoners was accidental, and nothing about the German response to that handling was predictable. The United States entered the war in December 1941, and by mid-1942 was receiving significant numbers of prisoners from the North African theater, where the back and forth of the Desert Campaign meant that both sides were regularly capturing enemy soldiers who then had to be housed, fed, and managed for the duration. The Geneva Convention, which both the United States and Germany had signed, established minimum standards for prisoner treatment, and both sides were, in the European and North African theaters, largely abiding by those standards, partly out of genuine commitment, and partly out of the calculation that mistreating enemy prisoners would result in the mistreatment of one's own men in captivity. The American decision to bring German prisoners to camps in the continental United States was driven by logistics as much as by policy. The camps in Britain were crowded. The camps in North Africa were difficult to secure and expensive to supply. The United States had land, resources, and a labor shortage created by the demands of the war economy, and German prisoners, under the Geneva Convention's provisions for prisoner labor, could be put to work in ways that would partially offset the cost of housing them. By the end of the war, there were over 400,000 German prisoners in camps across America, working on farms, in canneries, in lumber operations, in military installations, contributing labor that was genuinely valuable to an economy stretched thin by the demands of arming and supplying a global war. The camps themselves were, by the standards of wartime captivity, extraordinary. Not comfortable in the civilian sense, but well supplied, well organized, and administered with a consistency that the prisoners found genuinely surprising. The food was not only adequate, but, by German wartime standards, abundant. The medical care was competent and freely given. The recreational facilities included libraries, sports equipment, musical instruments, theatrical sets, and in some camps, materials for classes and education programs that prisoners could attend voluntarily. American guards and administrators observed the prisoners with a mix of curiosity and professional caution, and the prisoners observed America with a mix of curiosity, confusion, and, in some cases, an ideological resistance that made the observations uncomfortable for the people making them. Heinrich Brandt was not, by his own later account, a committed National Socialist. He had joined the Hitler Youth because everyone joined the Hitler Youth, had absorbed the ideology with the specific passivity of someone who accepts the water he swims in without examining its composition, and had gone to war with a patriotism that was real and a political awareness that was limited. He believed in Germany. He believed in the German people and the German military and the German capacity to endure difficulty and prevail against enemies. He believed in these things not because he had examined them carefully and concluded they were true, but because he had grown up in an environment that presented them as the natural order of things, as obvious as gravity. What he had not believed until North Africa was that Germany could lose. The losses had started the process of revision, not just the battlefield losses, the specific defeats that could be absorbed within a narrative of temporary setback and eventual recovery, but the material losses, the staggering abundance of American equipment that had appeared in the North African theater in 1942 and 1943, and that bore no relationship to anything the German propaganda had led him to expect. The tanks and the trucks and the aircraft and the supplies, the sheer quantities of everything arriving constantly, replenished constantly, suggesting a productive capacity so far beyond what Germany could match that the tactical brilliance of individual German commanders was, in the end, an arithmetic problem with a fixed solution. He had said things about this to other soldiers carefully, in the specific understated way that men learn to express dangerous thoughts in environments where dangerous thoughts are monitored. The responses he got were mostly deflections, not denials, which told him that others were thinking similar things and were similarly reluctant to say so directly. Then came the camp. Then came Virginia. Then came the abundance of American life pressing itself against the wire fence in the form of supply trucks and local farmers and guards, who were, in most cases, men who had not been to Europe and who treated the prisoners with a professional distance that was not unkind, and that contained almost no trace of the hatred that German propaganda had insisted was the dominant American attitude toward Germans. And then came Private First Class James Whitmore. Whitmore was from Macon, Georgia, 20 years old, working his second month as a guard at the camp after training at Fort Benning. He was not, by any measure, a sophisticated man. He had finished high school, worked at his uncle's hardware store for a year, received his draft notice, completed his training, and been assigned to prisoner guard duty with no particular enthusiasm or resentment about the assignment. It was not the front. It was not glamorous. It paid the same as any other posting. He did it with the methodical adequacy that characterized most of his approach to military life. His German was approximately 20 words, all of them practical rather than conversational. The prisoners he guarded had varying amounts of English, ranging from essentially none to, in a few cases, near fluency acquired through education or pre-war employment. Heinrich Brandt had intermediate English, enough to make himself understood, not enough to be subtle. And on a Tuesday morning in August 1944, walking across the recreation yard toward the vegetable garden where he had been assigned to work that week, he passed within speaking distance of James Whitmore and said something that stopped both of them in their tracks. He said, "You will lose this war." Whitmore stopped walking. He looked at the German prisoner who had just said this to him with the directness of a man making a factual statement rather than an argument. What Whitmore said back is the beginning of a story that neither man had any idea they were entering. He said, "Say that again." Brandt said it again. "You will lose this war." His tone was not hostile. It was not triumphant. It was the tone of a man who has thought about something carefully and arrived at a conclusion and is reporting the conclusion because the situation seems to require honesty. Whitmore considered this for a moment. Then he said, "What makes you think that?" It was not, by his own later account, the response he had planned to give. He had not planned to give any response. He had planned to tell the prisoner to get back to work and to file a report about the exchange with his sergeant and to move on with his mourning. He did not know why he asked the question. He asked it anyway. What followed was a conversation that began in the recreation yard and continued, in fragments and installments, over the following weeks, conducted in Brandt's limited English and Whitmore's complete absence of German, and occasionally, when the language gap became too wide, through a third prisoner who had enough English to bridge it. It was not a conversation that either man was supposed to be having. The regulations governing guard-prisoner relations were clear about professional distance, about the dangers of fraternization, about the ways in which prisoners could exploit personal connections to undermine security and discipline. Whitmore knew this. He had it in writing from his training. He violated it anyway, slowly and without quite deciding to, in the specific way that things that should not happen do happen when two people with genuinely different understandings of the same reality find themselves with time and proximity, and something at stake in the exchange. What Brandt told Whitmore over those weeks was not a coherent political argument. It was a collection of observations, impressions, and conclusions assembled from the specific vantage point of a man who had fought in North Africa and been captured and transported across the Atlantic, and was now sitting inside the wire of a camp in rural Virginia watching America conduct its war from the inside. He talked about the equipment, the staggering quantity of American military equipment he had seen in Tunisia, the tanks and trucks and artillery pieces that appeared in numbers suggesting a productive capacity unlike anything he had witnessed or heard described. He talked about the supply trucks that came to the camp, the regularity and abundance of them, the casual ease with which American logistics moved goods across distances that would have represented a logistical challenge of the first order in Europe. He talked about the food in the camp canteen, the variety of it, the fact that it was available without rationing, without the careful parsing of scarce resources that had become the normal condition of German civilian and military life. He talked about the farms visible beyond the perimeter, the size of them, the mechanization, the evidence everywhere of a country that produced more than it consumed, and had been doing so for generations and showed no sign of strain. He was describing, without the vocabulary for it, the industrial and agricultural foundation of American power, the material basis of the Allied victory that was, in August 1944, still 11 months in the future, but that was already legible to anyone who had been paying attention to the right things. Whitmore listened. He was not, by training or inclination, an economist or a strategic analyst. He was a 20-year-old guard from Georgia who had spent his life within a radius of about 50 miles from where he was born, and who had no particular framework for thinking about the things Brandt was telling him. But he was not stupid, and he was not incurious, and the specific quality of what Brandt was saying, the fact that it was being said by a German prisoner who had fought against American forces and was now making a case for American victory based on American strength, struck him as unusual enough to take seriously. He asked questions, not sophisticated questions, practical ones, the questions of a man who wants to understand something he has not thought about before. Why did you think you could win if the Americans had all this equipment? What did your commanders tell you about America? What did the newspapers say? What did the people at home believe? Brandt answered these questions with the care of a man who understood that the answers were complicated, and who was doing his best with a language that did not yet have all the words he needed. What he described was a propaganda system so comprehensive and so long established that it had become, for the people inside it, the texture of reality rather than a set of claims about reality. The German public had been told, every available channel, that the United States was a nation of degenerate materialism, of racial chaos, of social dissolution held together by the worst elements of Jewish finance and Hollywood corruption. It was a nation without military tradition or martial spirit, a nation that had been decisive in the previous war only because it had arrived when the fighting was almost done, and the real armies were already broken. A nation that would, when tested, reveal the fundamental weakness of its character and collapse before the organized will of a people who had rediscovered their racial identity and their historical destiny. This was what they had been told, and they had believed it not because they were stupid, not because they lacked the capacity for critical thought, but because the system had been built specifically to prevent critical thought from having the materials it needed to operate. Information that contradicted the official picture was suppressed. Information that supported it was amplified. The people inside the system had no reliable access to the outside, and the outside, as a result, remained theoretical in a way that made the claims about it seem plausible. Then Brandt had gone to North Africa and seen the outside. And the outside had looked nothing like what they had told him. Whitmore absorbed this over several conversations without knowing quite what to do with it, because the implications of what Brandt was telling him were uncomfortable in a way that went beyond the simple fact of a German prisoner making predictions about the outcome of the war. What Brandt was describing was the mechanism by which a population could be systematically prevented from understanding the reality it inhabited, could be fed a picture of the world so comprehensively false that even competent, intelligent people would act on it as though it were true, would go to war and die on the basis of it, would send their children to die on the basis of it. It was uncomfortable because Whitmore was 20 years old and had grown up in a country that also had newspapers and radio broadcasts and school textbooks and various authorities telling him what things meant. And the question of how much of what he had been told was reliable in the way he had assumed it was reliable was not a question he had previously found it necessary to consider. He did not share this part of his thinking with Brandt. He was 20 years old, and it was a lot to sort out. He filed it somewhere in the back of his mind and kept listening. The conversation shifted, as conversations do, from the abstract to the specific. Brandt began to ask questions of his own, questions that were at first cautious and then, as the exchange established its own peculiar trust, more direct. He asked about American attitudes toward the war, whether the American public supported it with the unanimity that German propaganda claimed was impossible in a democracy, whether there were political divisions that might produce the kind of negotiated settlement that some elements of the German military had been hoping for since 1943. He asked about the soldiers he had been captured by, what kind of men they were, whether they were volunteers or conscripts, whether they fought from conviction or compulsion. Whitmore answered what he could, which was not always much, because he was a 20-year-old guard from Georgia and not a pollster or a political analyst. But he answered honestly, and the honesty was itself a form of data for Brandt, because what it revealed was a man who had no particular reason to lie, and who was describing an America that was recognizable as the material reality Brandt had been observing since his capture. The soldiers were a mix, some volunteers, many conscripts, some fighting from conviction, many fighting because they had been told to, and because the men next to them were fighting, and the combination of duty and proximity was sufficient motivation for most of what military service required. They were not supermen. They were not the degenerate weaklings of German propaganda either. They were men doing a difficult thing in difficult circumstances with varying degrees of willingness and skill, which was, Brandt reflected, more or less what the German soldiers he had served with had also been. This observation, when he made it to Whitmore, produced a silence that lasted longer than most of their silences. Whitmore was not sure what to do with it. He was fighting, or at least wearing the uniform of men who were fighting, a war against a specific enemy, and the framework of the war required that enemy to be a certain kind of thing, different enough from the men on his own side to justify what was being done to them and by them. The observation that German soldiers were basically men doing a difficult job like American soldiers was not one that the framework of the war had prepared him to receive comfortably. He thought about it for several days and then came back to Brandt with a question that surprised both of them. He asked, if you know the war is lost, why are there still German soldiers fighting it? Brandt thought about this for a long time before answering. The answer he gave was not the one Whitmore had expected, which had been something about fanaticism or propaganda or the threat of punishment for desertion, all of which were true and all of which Brandt acknowledged. But the answer Brandt gave first was different. He said, because they are Germans and they are losing and they are ashamed. Whitmore did not fully understand this at the time. He understood it better later after the war, when the accounts of the final months of German resistance became available. The story of men fighting in the rubble of their own cities against an enemy who had already won, fighting not because they believed in the cause or expected the outcome to change, but because the alternative to fighting was something they did not have the internal resources to accept. The combination of national identity and military training, and the specific shame of being the ones who gave up when the country needed them, irrational from the outside and entirely coherent from the inside, was producing a resistance that prolonged the war past any point of military logic and killed enormous numbers of people on both sides in its final months. The conversations continued through the late summer and into the autumn of 1944, and they did not go unnoticed. The sergeant who ran the guard rotation on Brandt's barracks had observed the exchanges with the combination of professional concern and personal curiosity that characterized most of his responses to unusual situations in the camp. He did not intervene immediately, partly because nothing that Whitmore was doing was clearly prohibited, and partly because what was happening seemed to be producing information rather than undermining security. He watched and waited. In October, he called Whitmore in and asked him directly what was going on with the German corporal. Whitmore told him with an honesty that reflected either admirable candor or insufficient political cunning, depending on how you looked at it. He described the conversations, the content of them, the specific claim with which they had started, and what had come out of the subsequent weeks of exchange. The sergeant listened without interrupting. When Whitmore was finished, the sergeant asked one question. He asked, "Do you think he's right?" Whitmore said he thought Germany was going to lose the war, yes. He thought they were probably all going to be fine. He thought the German prisoner was telling him something true based on things the German prisoner had actually seen. And he thought the German prisoner was telling it to him because the German prisoner had concluded that the truth was more important, at this point, than whatever strategic advantage an argument for German victory might theoretically produce. The sergeant sat with this for a moment. Then he told Whitmore he was reassigning him to a different rotation and that he should keep his conversations with the prisoners to the minimum required by the job. Whitmore asked why. The sergeant said, "Because if he's right, you don't need to know it from him. And if he's wrong, it's not helping anyone for you to think he's right." This was not, by any standard of logical rigor, a convincing argument. Whitmore recognized this. He went to the new rotation without further protest, partly because questioning orders was not his characteristic response to instructions from his sergeant, and partly because he had enough to think about already. The conversations with Brandt ended. Or rather, they became the brief professional exchanges that the regulations prescribed, stripped of the content that had made them something other than professional. Both men understood what had happened, and neither of them discussed it. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The camp received the news on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week on which Brandt had made his original statement in the recreation yard, a coincidence that neither man assigned meaning to at the time, but that became, in later retellings, the kind of detail that accumulates significance through repetition. The prisoners in the camp received the news with a range of responses that defied any simple characterization. Some wept, from grief or relief or the specific exhaustion of men who have been carrying a weight for years and have finally been told they can put it down. Some received it with the careful stillness of men who have been expecting something for a long time and have already done their internal accounting. Some refused to believe it and had to be shown physical documentation before they would accept it. A small number were, even at this stage, committed enough to the ideology that they could not process the news as anything other than a betrayal by weak or corrupt elements of the German Lee. Dareship, a rationalization that the subsequent decades would not fully dissolve for everyone who held it. Brandt received the news in the morning and spent the afternoon in the vegetable garden, which was in its summer cycle, and required attention regardless of what was happening in Europe. He worked steadily through the afternoon, turning soil and pulling weeds and doing the things that the garden required, and when the work was done, he sat on the wooden bench at the edge of the garden and looked at the Virginia landscape beyond the wire fence and thought about Hamburg. His father was still there, assuming the bombing had left him. His mother, a sister who had been 19 when he shipped out and was now nearly 24 and had, for all he knew, experienced the previous 2 years of the war in ways that he could not fully imagine from inside the wire of a Virginia prisoner of war camp. He had been right. Germany had lost. The arithmetic he had worked out from the evidence of American supply trucks and camp canteens, and the scale of the farms he could see beyond the perimeter had resolved in exactly the direction the arithmetic had pointed. He had been right, and the Führer had been wrong, and the propaganda had been wrong, and the men who had made the promises and demanded the sacrifices had been wrong about the most fundamental question available to a national leadership, which is whether the thing they were asking their people to give their lives for was a thing that could be won. He did not feel satisfaction about being right. He felt something more complicated than that, something that mixed the specific relief of survived danger with the specific grief of knowing what the survival had cost, and the specific disorientation of being a man without a country, or rather a man whose country had just become something that would take years to understand and longer to inhabit. The repatriation process began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, as American camps processed the prisoners and arranged transport back to a Germany that was divided, occupied, and physically devastated, in ways that none of the returning men had fully prepared themselves for. The logistics were complicated and slow, and the men waited in the camps with the particular suspended quality of people who are between one life and another and have no access to either. Whitmore's tour ended in late 1945, and he went back to Georgia and took back his old job at his uncle's hardware store and began the process of being a civilian again, which took longer than he had expected and required more internal adjustment than anyone who had not done it seemed to understand. He thought about Brandt occasionally, in the specific way that you think about someone with whom you had a significant exchange that was never concluded, someone who said something that stayed with you longer than most things people say, that came back at unexpected moments and insisted on being thought about again. He thought about the question Brandt had answered about why German soldiers kept fighting when the war was already lost. He thought about the shame of it, the specific national shame of being the ones who gave up, the way that shame could compel men to continue a thing that had no rational justification because the alternative was a form of self-abandonment that felt worse than the cost of continuing. He thought about what this meant for the men in the American army who had fought in the final months of the war in Europe, men who had faced that German resistance in the streets of German cities, who had been shot at by soldiers who were fighting not from conviction but from shame, who had died or been wounded in the last days of a war that was already over in every way except the last one. He did not reach a tidy conclusion about any of this. He was a hardware store clerk from Georgia, and the conclusions available to him were the ones he could reach with the equipment he had, which was not the equipment of a historian or a philosopher, but the equipment of a man who had been in proximity to something large, and had done his best to understand it with the instruments available. What he kept from all of it was the specific memory of a Tuesday morning in August 1944, a German prisoner crossing a recreation yard, a statement made in limited English with the directness of someone reporting a conclusion rather than making an argument. "You will lose this war." And the question he had asked back, the question he had not planned to ask and had asked anyway, "What makes you think that?" Because the question mattered, because the answer had been true, because the man who gave the answer had arrived at it through observation and reasoning rather than ideology, had followed the evidence to a conclusion that the evidence supported even when the conclusion was the most unwelcome one imaginable for the man reaching it, had been willing to say out loud in a prisoner of war camp in rural Verg. Anaya what the arithmetic of the war had been telling anyone who was paying attention to the right things since 1942 at the latest. And because the exchange between them, brief and incomplete and conducted across a language gap and a cultural gulf and a wire fence, had produced something that neither man had expected and that neither of them would have described in the language of transformation, because that was too large a word for what had actually happened. What had happened was smaller and more durable than transformation. Two men had talked to each other across a boundary that was supposed to prevent talking. One of them had said a true thing. The other had listened. And in the listening, something had shifted in the listener that the war and the training and the regulations and the professional distance and all the institutional structures designed to prevent exactly this kind of shift had not been able to prevent. He had understood something he had not understood before. Not about the war, not about Germany, about the difference between what a system tells you and what the evidence shows you, between the picture of the world that institutions provide and the picture that a man who has looked at the world directly from close range is trying to communicate to you across a fence. It was not a lesson that came with easy application. Most lessons of that kind do not. You absorb them and carry them and take them out at odd moments and look at them in the light of whatever situation you are currently navigating. And sometimes they are useful and sometimes they are just there, present and persistent, refusing to be filed away with the other things that time eventually dissolves. James Whitmore carried his until he was an old man. Heinrich Brandt went back to Hamburg and rebuilt a life in a Germany that was rebuilding everything. And he became, over the decades, the kind of man who had a story that his children found interesting and his grandchildren found remarkable. The story of the summer in Virginia when he had told an American guard the truth about the war, and the American guard had asked him why he thought so. The truth, he told them, was that he had not known he was telling the truth at the time. He had known he was saying what the evidence supported. Whether that was the same thing as truth was a question that the rest of his life had not fully resolved. But the evidence had been there for anyone who looked at it. The supply trucks, the camp canteen, the farms beyond the wire, the casual abundance of a country at war with the lights on and the shelves stocked and the machines running, a country so far from any battlefield that war for it was a thing that happened at a remove, something it was sending men and equipment to rather than something it was surviving on its own soil. He had looked at it and said what it showed. And an American guard from Georgia had asked him the right question. And the arithmetic had resolved the way arithmetic resolves when the numbers are what they are. Germany lost the war. The farms beyond the wire kept producing. The supply trucks kept coming. The men in the camp were repatriated and went home to lives that the war had changed in ways that took decades to understand. And somewhere in all of it, in the spaces between the large historical forces and the vast institutional structures, and the official narratives that nations construct about what their wars meant, and why they fought them, and what they were willing to do in the fighting, two men had talked to each other honestly. That was not nothing. In the long run, it was not nothing at all. To understand why Heinrich Brandt's statement landed the way it did, you have to understand something about the specific psychology of the men who were guarding German prisoners in the American interior during the Second World War, because they were a different kind of soldier from the men who were fighting in France and Italy and the Pacific, and the difference mattered in ways that are not immediately obvious. The guards were mostly men who had been through basic training and been deemed, for one reason or another, unsuited for combat deployment. Some had medical profiles that restricted their duties. Some had critical skills in other areas that the Army needed elsewhere. Some had simply been assigned to the military police or to prisoner guard functions by the random operations of an institutional machine that was processing millions of men and could not optimize every placement. They wore the uniform and drew the pay and were technically soldiers, but they had not been through what the men in the ETO had been through, had not stood in the mud at Monte Cassino or come ashore at Utah Beach or dug in against a German counterattack in the Belgian winter. And they knew it, and the prisoners they were guarding knew it too. This created a specific dynamic in the camps that was different from what you would find in a combat theater. The PR. Eiseners had fought. Many of them had fought well and hard and against odds, had earned their captures through the specific mathematics of a war in which the side with more of everything eventually ground the side with less down to the point of exhaustion. They had been soldiers in the full sense of the word, and they knew it, and some of them were not shy about communicating this knowledge to the men who were guarding them. The guards, for their part, were navigating a complex set of responses that they had not been fully prepared for. The training had prepared them for the security aspects of prisoner management, the regulations and the procedures and the protocols for preventing escape and maintaining order. It had not prepared them particularly well for the human aspects, for the daily reality of being in sustained proximity to men who were, in almost every respect except political allegiance, recognizably similar to themselves. German prisoners of the era, particularly the Afrika Korps veterans who formed a large portion of the early intake, were often educated, professional soldiers who had served in a technically sophisticated army. Many of them spoke English or French or both. Many of them had education and technical skills that the camp administration found useful, and that created interactions between guards and prisoners that went beyond the purely custodial. A prisoner who was a trained mechanic working on camp equipment was not simply an object of surveillance. He was a man doing a job alongside or near American soldiers doing similar jobs, and the proximity produced the kind of human reality that formal categories have difficulty containing. In this environment, the statement that Brandt made to Whitmore was less aberrant than it might appear in the abstract. It was one point in a continuum of exchanges between the people inside the wire and the people outside it, exchanges that the regulations tried to limit and that human nature persistently found its way around. What made Brandt's specific statement different was its content, not its existence. He was not making small talk about the weather or asking about camp procedures or discussing the mechanics of the work he was assigned to. He was making a claim about the outcome of the war, a claim that, if true, had implications for everyone in and around that camp, and he was making it with a directness that suggested he meant it and had thought about it and was prepared to defend it. Whitmore's question, asking what made him think so, was the question that any honest person would have asked in that situation, and it opened a conversation that neither man had been authorized to have. The camp administration, when it eventually became aware of the exchanges, was not without its own views on the subject. The intelligence function of the prisoner of war system was, by 1944, reasonably well developed. American intelligence had learned, through experience with earlier prisoner groups, that the camps contained information that was potentially valuable, information about German military organization and capabilities and morale and doctrine that could not always be obtained through more direct means. Trained intelligence officers conducted formal interrogations, and the results fed into assessments that reached various levels of the command structure. What the formal interrogation system was less good at capturing was the kind of information that came out in informal exchanges, the offhand observations, the small revelations, the things that a prisoner might say in a casual conversation that he would never say in a formal session with an officer who was clearly conducting an intelligence interview. The value of this kind of information had been recognized, and some camps had developed informal systems for capturing it, using guards who were trained to report significant conversations rather than simply preventing them. Whitmore was not one of those guards. He had received no training in intelligence collection and had no systematic process for reporting what he observed. He was simply a young man who had been told an interesting thing by a prisoner and had asked a follow-up question and had found himself, over the following weeks, in possession of a progressively more complete picture of the war as it looked from inside the perspective of someone who had fought it on the other side. The picture was not flattering to the German cause, but neither was it the simple picture of German incompetence and American inevitability that the American public narrative of the war sometimes suggested. What Brandt was describing was a formidable enemy that had made a catastrophic mistake, an army that had fought with genuine skill and genuine courage, in service of a strategic situation that was objectively impossible, and that its leadership had refused to acknowledge as impossible until the acknowledgement was forced by facts that could not be denied. This was, in its way, a more useful picture than either of the simpler alternatives. It explained why the war had taken as long as it had. It explained why the casualties on both sides had been as heavy as they were. It explained why the men who had been through the fighting were often less triumphalist about it than people who had not been through it expected them to be, because they had faced a real enemy doing real things effectively, and had prevailed through the specific combination of material superiority and tactical competence, and sheer will that produced Allied victory, rather than through the effortless march of an obviously superior force against an obviously inferior one. There were other conversations in other camps that summer and autumn, conversations with different prisoners and different guards that covered different ground, but that shared the basic quality of the exchange between Brandt and Whitmore. The prisoner of war system, in its size and its duration and its particular intimacy, created conditions for a kind of informal diplomatic exchange that had no official name or official function, but that was, in retrospect, among the more significant things that happened in the American interior during the years of the war. Men who had been enemies looked at each other across the distances that enmity creates and tried, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of honesty, to understand what they were looking at. Some of what they found confirmed the categories they had brought with them. Some of what they found required the categories to be revised. And some of what they found was simply the irreducible human reality that two people in sustained proximity eventually encounter. The discovery that the person across the wire is not the abstraction that the war requires him to be, but a specific man with a specific history and specific observations about the specific world they both inhabit. This did not end the war faster. It did not change the strategic situation. It did not produce policy changes or intelligence breakthroughs or any of the measurable outcomes that institutional systems recognize as significant. What it produced was harder to measure and longer lasting. It produced, in the men who experienced it, a modification of the picture, a complication of the simple story, an addition to the understanding that the simpler story left out. Some of those men took what they had learned back into their post-war lives and used it in ways that shaped what they did and how they thought about things and what they were willing to say out loud about the nature of enemies and the reliability of official pictures of the world. Some of them became the people in their communities who complicated the narrative when it needed complicating, who asked the question that the room had not thought to ask, who remembered, when the institutional pressure was toward simplification, that the world was more complex than the institutional picture allowed. Others put it away and got on with their lives and did not think about it again, except occasionally, in the specific moments when something in the present connected unexpectedly to something in the past, and the connection produced a recognition that was not quite comfortable and not quite dismissible. Whitmore was somewhere between these two. He went back to Georgia and the hardware store and the civilian life that the war had interrupted, and he carried the conversations with him in the way that you carry things that have no immediate application, but that you cannot quite put down. He told the story occasionally to people he trusted, not as a lesson or a parable, but as a report of something that had happened to him and that he still found interesting and that he was still, in certain ways, trying to understand. He told it as the story of a German prisoner who had told him the truth about the war before the truth was fully visible. And he told it as the story of his own question, the question he had not planned to ask, "What makes you think that?" Because the question was the thing he was most proud of in retrospect, not the listening, which had been largely passive, not the understanding, which had come gradually and incompletely. The question, the decision to engage rather than dismiss, to ask rather than report and move on, to treat the statement as something worth examining rather than something to be processed through the appropriate channels and filed. The question had been his, and the answer that came back had been true. That was the story. A man who knew something important said it to a man who was willing to hear it, and the hearing changed something in the listener that the formal structure of their relationship had been designed to prevent being changed. The war ended, Germany was rebuilt, the camps were closed, the prisoners went home, the guards went home, the wire fences came down and the wooden barracks were demolished and the fields returned to whatever they had been. E'en before the war had found a use for them. And somewhere in the record of it, between the official reports and the formal histories and the statistics of captures and casualties and prisoner counts, was the story of a Tuesday morning in August 1944, when a German corporal walked across a recreation yard in rural Virginia and said 4 words to an American guard that were, by any measure, the most honest assessment of the war's outcome available in that time and place. "You will lose this war." He was wrong about one word. Germany lost it. And the man who told the truth about that, early, clearly, from inside the wire of an enemy camp, with limited English and complete directness, had understood something that the leadership of his country had refused to understand, until the understanding was forced upon them by the specific and unforgiving arithmetic of a war they had started against an enemy they had catastrophically underestimated. He had looked at the supply trucks. He had looked at the farms. He had looked at the camp canteen with its unstinted shelves. And he had done the math. There is a coda to this story that belongs at the end, because stories like this one do not resolve cleanly at the point where the main events conclude. They continue in the lives of the people who experienced them, in the ways those people changed and did not change, in what they carried forward and what they left behind. James Whitmore stayed in Macon after the war and worked at the hardware store for 11 years before buying it from his uncle, who retired in 1956. He married a woman named Dorothy in 1948 and had 3 children. He served on the city council in the late 1960 and was known, by those who knew him, as a man who asked questions that other people found inconvenient, who pushed back when official explanations seemed insufficient, who had a tolerance for ambiguity and a suspicion of simple stories that some of his neighbors found admirable and some found aggravating. He did not talk about the war very much. Men of his generation often did not. When he did, the story he told most frequently was not a combat story, because he had no combat stories, but the story of the German prisoner and the recreation yard and the question he had asked back. He told it because it was the story from those years that seemed to him most worth telling, not because it was dramatic, though it had its drama, because it was true, and because the truth in it was the kind that resisted the erosion that most truths undergo when the years pass and the context changes, and the people who were there are no longer there to object to the simplified version. The truth in it was this: a man who was in a position where honesty cost him something had been honest anyway. He had been on the losing side of the largest war in human history, imprisoned inside a wire fence in a country he had been told was his enemy, in a position where everything around him argued for the maintenance of whatever pride and certainty he could sustain. And he had looked at the supply trucks and the farms and the canteen shelves, and he had done the arithmetic, and he had said the thing the arithmetic showed, to the first person who gave him the opening to say it. There was something in that worth preserving, something that resisted the large narratives about the war, the narratives of national character and ideological conflict and civilizational survival, and insisted on being something smaller and more specific. One man, one morning, one honest statement about a reality that the official picture was designed to obscure. Whitmore thought about it across the years, when the country he lived in was doing the things that countries do when the official picture and the observable reality begin to diverge. He thought about it when he read the newspapers and found them reporting things that his own observations of the world suggested were incomplete. He thought about it when authority spoke with certainty about matters where his own knowledge suggested the certainty was not warranted. He thought about it when he watched his children absorb the pictures of the world that institutions provide, and wondered how much of what they were absorbing would hold up under the specific scrutiny of direct observation. He was not a philosopher, and he did not draw large conclusions from what was, in the end, a small story. He was a hardware store owner from Georgia who had once guarded German prisoners, and had once had a conversation that he had not forgotten. But he thought the small story mattered. He thought the specific quality of what Brandt had done, the willingness to say what the evidence showed even when the evidence showed something unwelcome, was a quality worth noticing and worth naming and worth, in some quiet and private way honoring. Because it was rarer than it looked. Because the pressures against it were constant and structural and well-organized, and the pressures in its favor were interior and individual, and easy to override. Because the men who do it, who look at the supply trucks and the farms and the stocked shelves and say out loud what they show, are not always listened to, and are not always thanked, and do not always live to see the arithmetic resolve the way the arithmetic shows it will. But they are right. And in the long run, the people who asked the question, who said what makes you think that instead of moving on, are the reason the truth gets carried forward from the people who found it to the people who need it. You will lose this war. What makes you think that? The supply trucks, the farms, the shelves. Look, the broader history of the American prisoner of war camps during the Second World War contains stories that have never fully entered the popular understanding of that conflict, partly because they do not fit easily into the clean narrative of Allied righteousness against Axis evil, and partly because the people who were in them, on both sides of the wire, tended to carry them privately rather than publicly. There were 425 camps spread across 46 states by the end of the war. They held at their peak approximately 425,000 German prisoners, along with substantial numbers of Italian and Japanese prisoners in separate facilities. The German camps were, by almost every account, administered with a professionalism and a basic decency that stood in sharp contrast to what German prisoners experienced in Soviet captivity, where mortality rates were catastrophic, and to what American prisoners experienced in German captivity, where conditions varied widely, but where the systematic brutality of the Eastern Front and the death camps was always a presence that shaped the context even when it was not directly applied. This is not to say that the American camps were without incident or without injustice. There were beatings. There were political pressures within the prisoner community, particularly from committed Nazis who attempted to intimidate and coerce other prisoners into maintaining the ideological position that the war was not over and that Germany would ultimately prevail. There were escapes, most of them unsuccessful, and there were punishments for escape attempts that were within the bounds of the Geneva Convention, but that were not gentle. There were guards who were cruel and guards who were negligent, and guards who brought to the job the specific laziness or the specific pettiness that some people bring to every job regardless of what the job is. But the overall picture was of a system that functioned with a basic competence and a basic humanity that was, in the context of the Second World War, remarkable. And part of what made it remarkable was the scale of it. The fact that the United States had absorbed nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers into its interior and had managed them, over a period of several years, without the mass atrocities or the systematic brutalization that characterized prisoner treatment on so many other fronts of the war. The question of why this happened is worth asking, because the answer is not obvious. The Geneva Convention is part of the answer, but only part, because the convention was being violated on multiple fronts by multiple parties, and the fact of its existence was clearly insufficient to guarantee its observance wherever compliance was inconvenient. The American observance of the convention was not simply a matter of legal obligation. It was a matter of institutional culture and national character, and the specific calculations of a country that was fighting a global war, and understood that the treatment of enemy prisoners was a variable that would affect the treatment of its own men in enemy hands. It was also, and this is the part that the clean institutional explanation tends to underweight, a matter of the individual men who ran the camps and guarded the prisoners, and made the daily decisions that collectively determined what kind of place a prisoner of war camp in rural Virginia or Texas or Colorado actually was. These men were not philosophers. They were not policy specialists. They were soldiers and clerks and administrators doing a job, and the job they did reflected what they were, which was the specific mixture of qualities that America in 1944 produced in its young men. What those qualities included, in sufficient measure and with sufficient frequency to make the system work the way it worked, was a basic human recognition of the man inside the uniform. The German prisoner was an enemy, the representative of a state that was fighting to the death against everything the United States was fighting for. He was also a man, specific and individual, with a history and a face and opinions and limitations, and the full range of human characteristics that people possess regardless of what uniform they are wearing or what government they are fighting for. The guards who managed this without losing either the professional distance the job required or the basic humanity that the situation also required, who held both things at once without letting either one overwhelm the other, were doing something that sounds simple and is not. Whitmore was one of them, not distinguished, not heroic, not operating at any level of significance that the official record would find worth noting. Just a young man doing his job with enough curiosity and enough honesty to hear what a German prisoner had to say about the war, and to ask the question that the hearing required. It was enough. In a war of that scale, with that many people doing things that were much larger and much more consequential, the small things tend to disappear. They disappear into the statistics and the unit histories and the campaign analyses that provide the architecture of the historical record. The conversation in the recreation yard does not appear in any official document. The question does not appear in any intelligence report. The exchange between a Georgia guard and a Hamburg corporal on a Tuesday morning in August 1944 left no trace in the record that a historian looking for significant events would find. But it happened, and the man who asked the question carried it forward for the rest of his life. And in carrying it forward, he carried something that the official record does not contain, which is the specific texture of what that war was like for the people who were in it without being in the fighting, who were close enough to the thing to be changed by it and far enough away from the worst of it to have the time and the space to ask questions. The answer to the question he asked was true. Germany lost the war. The supply trucks kept coming, and the farms kept producing, and the canteen shelves stayed stocked, and the arithmetic resolved the way arithmetic resolves when the numbers are not in dispute. What makes you think that? Look around you. That was the answer, and it was enough.